Russia did not become the largest country on earth by accident, and the rulers who shaped it did not rise to power by being gentle. In the winter of 1703, a Tsar stood on the frozen marshes of the Neva Delta and declared that a city would be built there on nothing, on swamp and ice and sheer imperial will, and that this city would be Russia's window to the West. The question that haunts every chapter of Russian history from that moment forward is this: can a country be dragged into the future by one person's obsession, and if so, what does it cost the people being dragged? That question does not have a comfortable answer. It never did. And the 5 rulers we are going to examine today are not simply famous names on a timeline. They are 5 distinct answers to the same underlying problem. Russia is enormous, diverse, militarily exposed, socially fractured, and perpetually behind whatever frontier its rivals have already crossed. Each of these rulers looked at that problem and chose a solution. Some of those solutions were brilliant, some were catastrophic. Most were both at the same time, which is what makes Russian history so relentlessly gripping and so genuinely difficult to reduce to simple heroism or simple villainy. Let us begin where the modern Russian state arguably begins, with a man who was 6 feet 8 inches tall in an era when the average European man stood about 5 feet 5, who pulled teeth for recreation, who worked in Dutch shipyards under a false name, who executed his own son, and who transformed a medieval Muscovite tsardom into a European empire in the span of a single extraordinary and brutal reign. Peter I, known to history as Peter the Great, was born in Moscow in 1672, the 14th child of Tsar Alexis. He came to power in His childhood was soaked in palace violence. When Peter was 10 years old, a Streltsy uprising, the Streltsy being the old guard musketeers of the Russian military, resulted in several of his relatives being hacked to death in front of him on the steps of the Kremlin. He watched men he knew dragged away and killed. That kind of trauma either breaks a child or forges something harder than iron, and in Peter's case it did the latter. He grew up with a pathological hatred of the old Moscow court culture, of its beards and its robes and its icons, and its resistance to anything that smelled of foreign innovation. He also grew up with an obsessive love of ships, of military engineering, of the sea, of things that moved and worked and could be understood mechanically. These two impulses, the destructive and the constructive, would define his entire reign. By 1697, Peter was 25 years old and already nominally in control of Russia, though he shared power uneasily with his half-sister Sophia for years. He made a decision that was, by the standards of any European monarch of the time, almost incomprehensible. He organized what was called the Grand Embassy, a diplomatic mission to Western Europe, and he went with it, traveling incognito as a man named Pyotr Mikhailov, working in the shipyards of Zaandam in the Netherlands, studying anatomy in Amsterdam, meeting William of Orange, visiting arsenals and factories and hospitals. He was not sightseeing, he was studying. He wanted to understand how the West worked so he could dismantle Russia and rebuild it along Western lines. He came back in 1698 and immediately held what became one of the most symbolically charged events in Russian history. He summoned his boyars, the old noble class, to court and personally cut off their beards with scissors. This sounds almost comedic until you understand what it meant. In Orthodox Christian Russia, the beard was not a fashion choice, it was a theological statement. Men believed they were made in the image of God, and that image included a beard. To shave was to deface the divine image. Peter did not care. He cut the beards himself, laughing, and those who refused to comply were taxed for the privilege of keeping them. It was a declaration of war against the old Russia, announced with a pair of scissors. What followed over the next quarter century was one of the most compressed and violent modernization campaigns in world history. Peter reorganized the army along European lines, building it from roughly 40,000 men to over 200,000. He created a navy from nothing, commissioning dozens of warships for the Baltic and the Caspian. He built St. Petersburg, that city on the swamp, founding it in 1703 during the Great Northern War against Sweden, which was at the time the dominant military power in Northern Europe. The construction of St. Petersburg killed tens of thousands of conscripted laborers and serfs. The ground was waterlogged, the winters were murderous, disease was constant. Peter did not slow down. He moved the capital there from Moscow in 1712, forcing the entire Russian court and administrative apparatus to relocate to a city that was still being built around them, a city that was architecturally Dutch and Italian and French, a city that looked nothing like Russia and was designed to look nothing like Russia. He reformed the calendar, the alphabet, the administrative system, the church. He abolished the Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1721 and replaced it with a state-controlled body called the Holy Synod, effectively making the church a department of government. He introduced the table of ranks, a system that defined social status not by birth, but by state service, which was a genuinely radical idea in a feudal society. He sent young Russians abroad to study. He imported foreign experts by the hundreds. He taxed beards, bathhouses, and beehives to fund it all. And yet, the serfs who built St. Petersburg remained serfs. The peasant majority of Russia, the overwhelming mass of the population, experienced Peter's modernization as an increase in their burden, not a liberation. The taxes rose, the conscription was brutal, the reforms were for the state, not for the people. Peter created a modern European-style empire on the backs of an essentially medieval peasant society, and that contradiction would not be resolved for another century and a half, and arguably not even then. He died in 1725, reportedly from complications related to a urinary tract infection, having never fully named a successor, which plunged Russia into decades of palace coups and unstable reigns. But the empire he built survived, and the template he established, the autocratic modernizer, who forces change from above at enormous human cost, would echo through every subsequent ruler we are about to discuss. The next figure arrived at the Russian throne in 1762 under circumstances that were, to put it diplomatically, irregular. Catherine II, Catherine the Great, was not Russian. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, a minor German princess from a tiny principality, the daughter of a Prussian military officer. She was brought to Russia at 14 to marry the future Peter III, and from the moment she arrived, she understood that survival in the Russian court required her to become more Russian than the Russians. She learned the language. She converted to orthodoxy with apparent sincerity. She read voraciously Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, the entire canon of French Enlightenment thought. She was, intellectually, one of the most formidable people ever to sit on the Russian throne, and she had been sitting next to the throne for nearly 2 decades, watching, waiting, and planning. Peter III, her husband, was by most contemporary accounts a disaster. He admired Frederick the Great of Prussia to an almost embarrassing degree, reversed Russia's military gains in the 7 Years' War to make peace with Prussia, alienated the church, and managed to offend nearly every powerful constituency in Russia within 6 months of taking the throne. In July 1762, Catherine moved. With the support of the Orlov brothers and the Izmailovsky Guards regiment, she staged a coup. Peter III abdicated and was dead within a week, almost certainly murdered, though Catherine's direct involvement remains historically disputed. She was 33 years old, and she had just made herself Empress of Russia. What she did with that power over the next 34 years is one of the most complex stories in European history. She corresponded with Voltaire and called herself his pupil. She collected art on a scale that would eventually form the core of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. She convened a legislative commission in 1767 to discuss legal reform, producing a document called the Nakaz, or Instruction, which drew heavily on Enlightenment principles and discussed things like the rule of law and the limits of punishment. European intellectuals were dazzled. Voltaire called her the greatest ruler in Europe. But here is the contradiction that sits at the heart of Catherine's reign, and it is a sharp one. While she was writing about Enlightenment principles and corresponding with philosophers, she was also presiding over the most dramatic expansion of serfdom in Russian history. After the Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775, the largest peasant uprising in Russian history, led by a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, who claimed to be the murdered Peter III and who briefly controlled a vast swath of southeastern Russia before being captured, broken on the wheel, and beheaded in Moscow. Catherine's response was not reform, it was consolidation. She tightened noble control over the serfs. She issued the Charter of the Nobility in 1785, which dramatically expanded the rights and privileges of the noble class, while the serfs beneath them became closer to outright property than ever before. The Enlightenment Empress was simultaneously the empress who made Russian serfdom more rigid and more entrenched. She expanded Russia's territory enormously, annexing Crimea in 1783, partitioning Poland 3 times in concert with Prussia and Austria, pushing Russia's borders south toward the Black Sea and west into Europe. She was a brilliant strategist, a skilled manager of men, a patron of culture on a European scale, and a ruler who left the fundamental social injustice of Russia's agrarian system not only intact but reinforced. She died in 1796, and the question she left unanswered, the question of what to do about the serfs, would fester for another 65 years. Now we move into darker territory. Nicholas I came to the throne in December 1825 under circumstances that were almost immediately violent. On the very day of his accession, a group of liberal military officers staged an uprising in Senate Square in St. Petersburg. These were the Decembrists, men who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, had seen Western Europe, had read Enlightenment philosophy, and had returned to Russia determined to end autocracy and serfdom. They were disorganized, they were hesitant, and they were crushed. Nicholas had 5 of the ringleaders hanged and over 100 others sent to Siberia. He watched the executions himself, and from that moment his entire reign was shaped by what he had seen in Senate Square. Nicholas I ruled from 1825 to 1855, 30 years, and his reign was in many ways the apotheosis of Russian autocracy, the system pushed to its logical extreme. He was not stupid, he was actually quite intelligent, detail-oriented, and genuinely devoted to what he understood as Russia's interests. But he was also profoundly, viscerally afraid of revolution, and that fear curdled into a system of control so comprehensive that it became almost a character in its own right. He created the Third Section, a secret police force with sweeping powers to monitor, arrest, and exile anyone suspected of subversive thought. He imposed strict censorship on books, newspapers, and even private correspondence. He expelled foreign ideas the way a body expels infection. His ideological framework was articulated by his Minister of Education, Sergei Uvarov, in what became known as official nationality, a doctrine built on three pillars: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. This was Nicholas's answer to the French Revolution and to liberalism generally. Russia did not need constitutional government, it did not need civil liberties, it did not need Enlightenment individualism, because Russia had something better: the Orthodox faith, the Tsar, as God's anointed representative, and the organic unity of the Russian people. It was a powerful ideology, emotionally resonant, and it was also a fortress built around a system that was increasingly unable to compete with the industrializing West. The problem with building a fortress is that you eventually have to fight outside it. The Crimean War, which began in 1853, exposed the catastrophic gap between Nicholas's imperial self-image and Russia's actual military and logistical capacity. Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire fought Russia on Russian soil in Crimea, and Russia lost. The Russian military, which Nicholas had spent 30 years polishing as a symbol of imperial power, could not move troops efficiently because there were almost no railways. Its rifles were inferior, its supply chains were a disaster. The Tsar, who had dedicated his reign to maintaining order and suppressing change, had presided over 30 years of stagnation, while the rest of Europe industrialized around him. Nicholas died in February 1855, during the war, possibly of pneumonia, possibly of despair. He left behind a Russia that had been preserved in amber while the world moved on, and the catastrophic cost of that preservation was now visible to everyone. But the story does not end with Tsars. It ends, or rather transforms, in a sealed train carriage crossing Germany in April 1917. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin, was 46 years old when the German government, calculating correctly that his presence in Russia would accelerate the collapse of the Russian war effort, allowed him to travel in a sealed train from Zurich to Petrograd, the renamed St. Petersburg. Russia was already in revolution. The Tsar, Nicholas II, had abdicated in March. A provisional government was attempting to hold the country together while continuing to fight in the First World War. Lenin had other plans. Lenin had been a revolutionary since his early 20s, radicalized in part by the execution of his older brother Alexander in 1887, who had been hanged for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. He had spent years in Siberian exile, years in European emigration, building the Bolshevik Party into a disciplined, centralized revolutionary organization. He had developed a theory of revolution that departed from orthodox Marxism in crucial ways. Where Marx had argued that revolution would emerge organically from the contradictions of capitalism, Lenin argued that it needed to be led by a vanguard party, a tight professional revolutionary organization that could seize the moment when it came. He had been waiting for that moment for most of his adult life. He arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd on April 3, 1917, stepped onto an armored car, and immediately told the crowd that the provisional government was a fraud and that the war had to end. Within 6 months, in October 1917, the Bolsheviks had seized power in a coup that was swift, decisive, and surprisingly bloodless in its initial phase, though the civil war that followed would kill millions. The Winter Palace was stormed, the provisional government collapsed. Lenin was in control of what had been the Russian Empire. What he built in the years that followed was something genuinely new in world history. The Soviet state was not simply a different government, it was a different theory of what government was for, of what society should look like, of what human beings owed each other and the collective. It abolished private ownership of land, it nationalized industry, it created a one-party state in which the Communist Party was the only legitimate political actor. It launched a campaign against religion, closing churches, arresting clergy, promoting atheism as state policy. It created a new secret police, the Cheka, which conducted what Lenin openly called the Red Terror, executing class enemies and political opponents by the thousands. The contradictions in Lenin's project were visible almost immediately. The peasants who made up the overwhelming majority of Russia's population did not want socialism. They wanted land, which the Bolsheviks promised them, and then they wanted to keep it, which the Bolsheviks did not allow. When the Civil War ended, the economy was in ruins. Famine killed millions in 1921 and 1922. Lenin, pragmatic enough to recognize catastrophe when he saw it, introduced the new economic policy in 1921, which partially restored market mechanisms and private trade. It was a tactical retreat, he said. It was also an admission that the pure revolutionary vision could not survive contact with reality. Lenin suffered a series of strokes beginning in 1922 and died in January 1924. He had been in power for just over 6 years, and in that time he had destroyed one empire and built the foundations of another, one that would last until 1991. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum on Red Square, where it remains to this day, which tells you something important about the relationship between Soviet power and the need for sacred objects, the need for a body to venerate, even in an officially atheist state. The man who had abolished the church became in death something uncomfortably close to a saint. And then we arrive at the end. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev came to power in March 1985 as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And the first thing you need to understand about him is that he was not trying to end the Soviet Union, he was trying to save it. He was 54 years old, the youngest member of the Politburo, a man who had grown up in the Stavropol region of southern Russia, the grandson of peasants, a true believer in socialism who had also spent enough time talking to foreign leaders and reading classified reports to understand that the Soviet system was in serious trouble. The Soviet economy in 1985 was stagnating. Oil prices, which had been propping up the Soviet budget for a decade, were collapsing. The military was consuming roughly 15 to 20% of GDP in a competition with the United States that the Soviet economy could not sustain. The war in Afghanistan, which had begun in 1979 and which Soviet commanders had assumed would be over in months, was grinding into its 6th year with no end in sight, killing Soviet soldiers and destroying Soviet prestige. Corruption was endemic. Alcoholism was a public health catastrophe. The technological gap between the Soviet Union and the West was widening every year. Gorbachev looked at all of this and decided that the system needed to be reformed, not replaced. He introduced two concepts that became the defining words of the late Soviet era. Glasnost, meaning openness, a loosening of censorship and a permission to discuss the Soviet past honestly, including Stalin's crimes, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, an attempt to reform the Soviet economic and political system to make it more efficient and more responsive. These were not revolutionary ideas in Gorbachev's own mind. They were managerial reforms. He wanted a better Soviet Union, not no Soviet Union. But here's what Gorbachev did not fully understand, or perhaps understood and hoped to manage, that the Soviet system was not reformable in the way he imagined, because its legitimacy rested on a set of claims that could not survive honest examination. Once you allowed glasnost, once you permitted Soviet citizens and Soviet journalists to look honestly at the history of collectivization and the Gulag, and the show trials and the lies about economic performance and the lies about Afghanistan, you were not just reforming the system, you were dismantling the story that held it together. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986 was a turning point that Gorbachev himself later acknowledged. The explosion at the reactor in Ukraine, the initial cover-up, the eventual admission of catastrophic failure, the evacuation of an entire city, Pripyat overnight, the contamination of vast areas of Ukraine and Belarus, all of this demonstrated in the most visceral possible way the gap between Soviet official reality and actual reality. Glasnost made it impossible to pretend the gap did not exist. The Soviet media began, haltingly at first and then with increasing confidence, to report what was actually happening. In 1989, the Eastern European satellite states began to fall. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, one after another. The communist governments that the Soviet Union had installed and maintained since 1945 collapsed or were overthrown. Gorbachev did not send in the tanks. This was a decisive choice, different from 1956 in Hungary and 1968 in Czechoslovakia, when Soviet armor had crushed reformist movements. He let them go. The Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, and the world watched in astonishment. Inside the Soviet Union, the dynamic was accelerating. The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania declared independence. Nationalist movements erupted across the Caucasus and Central Asia. The Russian Republic itself, under Boris Yeltsin, declared sovereignty from the Soviet Union, which was a paradox so strange it almost defies description, Russia declaring independence from an entity that Russia itself dominated. In August 1991, hardliners in the Communist Party staged a coup against Gorbachev, placing him under house arrest at his dacha in Crimea. The coup failed partly because the plotters were incompetent and partly because Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian Parliament building and the crowds rallied to him. But the coup destroyed what remained of the Communist Party's authority. By December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus met in the Belovezhskaya Pusha forest and signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. Gorbachev spent the rest of his life, he died in 2022, in a strange historical limbo. In the West, he was celebrated as the man who ended the Cold War, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, a figure of extraordinary moral courage. In Russia, he was widely blamed for the collapse of the Soviet Union, which many Russians experienced not as liberation, but as catastrophe. The loss of superpower status, the economic chaos of the 1990s, the humiliation of watching the country they had grown up in simply cease to exist. Both reactions contain truth, and neither contains the whole truth. What connects these five figures across 3 centuries is something more than the fact that they all ruled Russia. What connects them is the recurring structure of the problem they faced and the recurring shape of the solutions they chose. Peter the Great modernized from above, using state power as a battering ram against tradition, creating a modern state apparatus on the backs of an unreformed peasant society. Catherine the Great expanded and consolidated that empire while reading Enlightenment philosophy and making serfdom worse. Nicholas I tried to freeze the empire in place and discovered that stasis is not stability. Lenin destroyed one empire and built another on a revolutionary ideology that could not survive honest contact with its own contradictions. Gorbachev tried to reform that second empire honestly and discovered that honesty was the one thing it could not survive. Each of these rulers understood that Russia's size and geography and social complexity made it extraordinarily difficult to govern. Each of them reached for power as the solution, either expanding it, concentrating it, systematizing it, or, in Gorbachev's case, carefully and fatally loosening it. None of them found a way to build a system that did not depend on the quality of the person at the top, which is perhaps the deepest and most persistent problem in Russian political history. The empire, the Soviet state, the modern Russian Federation, all of them have been built around the assumption that the right ruler can hold everything together, and all of them have been haunted by the question of what happens when the wrong one appears. Russia's history is not a story of inevitable despotism or inevitable failure. It is a story of real choices made by real people under real constraints, choices that created the next set of constraints which shaped the next set of choices. The swamp where Peter built his city is still there beneath the foundations of St. Petersburg. The question he asked in 1703, how do you make Russia strong enough to survive in the world as it actually is still being asked today. The answers keep changing. The question does not.